What I want to talk about this morning is based on a paper that I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago when I wanted to write something on emotions and power relationships. But really this links to political participation, because I think, as Steve has been saying, emotions are very powerful in terms of participation, what motivates people to do something about an issue. One of the other things I was also concerned about was the discourse in sociology, particularly linked to people like Zygmunt Bauman's work about an age of political indifference. And you can find this, I think, not only in social science, but also in everyday discourse. Because yesterday on the video with your interview with, is it Simon? Is it Simon? Simon was saying, oh, you know, how do we motivate young people to vote in an age of apathy and indifference? You know, people now are more interested in Big Brother and the X Factor and voting on X Factor than they are in sort of voting in elections and getting involved in politics. And when I did this work in the sort of mid-2000s, I thought, well, there's just been this huge protest against the Iraq War. You know, and the protest was in 2003, before the war. You know, this can't be right. This idea that people are just sat in front of the telly, you know, not interested in the world around them, not engaged in politics, not engaged in events, that can't be right. And also the whole idea that came out after 9/11 about the war on terror, which led to the wars in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. You know, the whole thing that characterised that was emotion. You know, we should be fearful, we should be frightened. You know, there are these terrible terrorists out there going to do bad things to us. You know, fear, and governments can offer security. So I think that in putting around that fear, Blair and Bush thought, you know, well, we've got an opportunity here to say to people, we can protect you. We can protect you against these fears. So emotion was a sort of very powerful organising factor in all of this. What I did was I looked at accounts of the demonstrations against the Iraq War. Particularly, I looked at the accounts of the London demonstration. On the 15th of February 2003, I don't know if people remember this, but there were huge protests against the Iraq War, the impending Iraq War, all over the world. There were massive protests in New York, London, Paris, you know, all over the globe. And millions of people were involved in this. And what I did, I looked at accounts in the British newspapers about the London demonstration, which was on the same day, 15th of February 2003. And I picked the Times and the Observer because traditionally they've represented different political affiliations in the UK. The Observer is, I picked the Observer, it's a Sunday newspaper, but it was the day after the demonstration. The Observer has traditionally been the more centre-left newspaper in the UK, the Times on the right. However, what was interesting was that there were articles in both papers that were pro and anti-war. So this really seemed to divide opinion, but not along traditional party lines. You know, it cut across those old left-right divisions. So what I did, I picked these newspapers for that reason, but also because in these broadsheet newspapers, there was some journalistic comment about the protests, but there was also a lot of protesters' accounts. So one particular article was made up completely of the words of protesters, demonstrators there on the day, with no added journalistic comment. And what was fascinating about looking at this was going to Steve's talk about how people are identified and how we sort of in groups and out groups, how journalists talked about the demonstration and how they talked in terms of what divided people were emotions. So, for example, when the Times was talking about the demonstration, it said this was a typically English affair. It was saying it was polite and restrained. So there was this whole idea about the British, being restrained in terms of their emotional expressions. And they said what was remarkable about the day, they said, was the garden centre ordinariness of the crowd. So it was like this middle class, restrained, polite affair. But then they said that was contrasted against, the usual suspects, CND, Socialist Worker Party, the anarchists, who love to come along and spit hate. And, so there was this idea that there's these people with very powerful, very strong emotions, but contrasted against the majority in the crowd who are polite, civilised, ordinary and everyday, who are safe, in other words. Interestingly, the Observer characterised it in exactly the same way. The anarchists spitting hatred and, trying to instigate violence. But then what the Observer said was that for them, although the crowd was well behaved and convivial, what they noted was the diversity in the crowd. They said there were groups of football supporters, Muslims, school kids. So there was, rather than saying this was Middle England out for a picnic, they were saying this was a massively diverse crowd. However, what was interesting, when you got to the protesters' account, the demonstrators' account of why they were there on that day and what had motivated them, they all said how strongly they felt. So the journalistic content attributing emotion to the crowd said, it was restrained. But when they talked to people, they said, some people were saying, this is our first demonstration. We've never been on a demonstration before, and what has got us out here is the strength of our feeling. And what most people said was they were angry. And they were angry about Blair and Bush. They were going ahead with the war. They were saying, not in our name. We don't want this. And these people are not listening to us. So what they were concerned about was not being listened to. And what they were expressing was anger, outrage at the way that governments were behaving. But also what they said was, the protest has been joyous, exhilarating. They got a sense of empowerment from coming together, expressing their views. And that gave them a feeling of joy and exhilaration. And I think Nathan pointed to similar things yesterday in your talk. Very wisely, you had pictures there instead of just text, which showed these emotions in the crowd. And you can see that. What interested me, though, was then how this connects with different theories of emotions and how we can start thinking about this from my point of view as a social scientist, but I think, for political science as well. Different theories of emotion. Steve talked about Durkheim and this idea of collective effervescence. The interesting thing about this, and I disagree with Steve slightly on this, because what Durkheim said in his book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, was that where you get crowds coming together, particularly Durkheim was looking at religious ceremonies and celebrations, and he said you get this collective effervescence, and this can create unity in a crowd. But Durkheim said it can also be dangerous. This collective effervescence can overwhelm the social order, and so things can run out of control. So you get this idea, I think very common in the late 19th, early 20th century, when Durkheim was writing, that emotions can quickly become irrational. And in Durkheim's book that he wrote with Marcel Mauss on anthropology, Durkheim said you find this in all societies, that where you get collectives coming together, driven by strong emotions, then that can quickly become irrational. Collective emotions can be irrational. Now, I wanted to get around that, and I wanted to suggest that emotions are actually generated relationally. It's a little bit like Steve was saying, emotions are about how we identify ourselves, the political groups we identify with, our values, the way we relate ourselves to others in society, and how that positions us in terms of events like the Iraq War. And that generates how we feel, not just how we think, but how we feel about events and political occasions, political occurrences. Someone who's already written about this is Theodore Kemper, and he's tried to develop a relational view of emotions. But what Kemper does is that he links this to status and power. And what is key in this is humiliation. And Kemper says that, basically, I'm not going to go through all these things, but basically what Kemper says is that we feel humiliated if we lose status and power. And that sense of humiliation drives us to try to restore our sense of rightness about the world, to restore our status. And Kemper in this article, particularly about the response to the attacks on America on 9th of September 2001, Kemper says that most Americans will respond, out of anger to these attacks because they've lost status and they want that status restored. Now, what I thought was interesting about these protests was that sections of American society and sections of British society didn't respond that way. They responded out of anger, but out of anger against their own governments and the way their governments were dealing with things. And so what I wanted to do was to ask questions about that, how emotions follow these relational logics, but you can't map them in advance. There's something unpredictable about the way that these emotional, relational patterns work themselves out. So some groups turned against their own governments. Recently, I found a really interesting article written by Silber, and she talks about civic anger as being a powerful mobilizing force that can move people to collective action. And what I find interesting about this is Silber came up with this idea in work on collective philanthropy, on elite philanthropy. And she did this study in Israel about why people give. Why do wealthy Israelis give? And what she found was, in some ways not surprising, that people give out of a sense of they've achieved, they've become wealthy, they want to share that wealth around. They give out of a sense of compassion. They identify with certain groups, with underprivileged groups. They want to do something about that. They want to do something about inequality. But what she found united all elite philanthropists was a sense of civic anger, or what she calls civic anger. People were angry with the government, and they didn't trust them to do things about inequality. They felt they'd messed up their policies and that they had to become involved to do something about it. And they were angry with the government. And what I liked about this was it was backing up a lot of things that I was saying in the article. We always like things that back up what we've said in previous pieces, don't we? And what I liked about it was it illustrated what I was trying to say about emotions, that these are complex. and often ambivalent. You know, and like Steve was saying about Freud and how Freud can still be, you know, interesting to us when we look at emotions, that we're not motivated out of one single emotion. We're not motivated to do things out of one emotion. Anger, compassion. It can be a mixture of all these things, and these things can be contradictory and ambivalent. But even so, emotions are powerful in motivating people to do things. So, politics, emotions, participation. What I'm arguing here then, in summary, is that in the war on terror, governments tried to govern the field of conduct. They tried to manipulate people through emotions, particularly fear, hope, you know, fear of terrorist attacks, hope that governments could protect people, could create security. But you couldn't predict how people were going to respond in advance. Not everyone responded on the basis of fear or shame. People made judgments on the basis of their own emotional, evaluative stances, and that was based on their biographical trajectory and their identification with particular groups, particular ideologies, and particular values. And that because of that, emotions had a complex pattern as they were embedded in multiple networks of social relations, power relations, affording different positions and possibilities for government, opposition and resistance. Now, I say that because, of course, not everybody was motivated to join in these protests. You know, some people were indifferent, some people didn't turn out, some people didn't do anything to try to stop the war, some people supported it. You know, probably went along with Blair and Bush and supported them, but not everybody did. And what I was trying to do in this paper was work out those complex sets of positionings and how emotion was integral to that. So, just finally to conclude, what I was arguing here and what I've been trying to argue today is that people are emotionally involved in events that mark their lives. No matter what those emotions are, they're emotionally positioned towards them. And that emotions mobilise people to political participation. But also similar feelings may also characterise less dramatic, everyday political engagements or disengagements. And this is where I'm interested in what Nathan is doing in his work. Because what Nathan is showing really is that behind what people regard as political disengagement, so for example, young people not getting involved in politics, if you talk to young people about why that is, you know, they give reasons that are very passionate. You know, well, I'm concerned with other things, or, you know, I don't like the government, or I'm angry because of this or that. So behind what seems on the surface to be disengagement, there's actually a very passionate engagement with politics and events. Also, what I'm arguing here against classical thinkers is that emotions are not irrational forces, but follow this relational pattern and logic. So that when we come to think about politics, political engagement, and power relations, we've got to think about emotions. And I don't think that thinking about those things separate from emotions really makes sense. Okay, there we go, thank you.